being here in these parlous and dangerous times. And I'd like to just address the question of what we can do in a dividing and conflicting world where conflicts and divisions and differences of opinion are translated into military action, into death and destruction, and in fact, not just loss of human life, but the loss of historical buildings and civilization. How can we bridge the divides and do something about it? I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that many bemoan the fact that we have lost the influence of the principles that guided the creation of the United Nations after the end of the Second World War, which were principles of a rules-based order, a world order that was based on certain rules, certain things that were right and others that were wrong, that were acceptable or not acceptable, both within countries, in their own governments, and in the international sphere. As some have pointed out from different continents, these rules were in many ways Western rules, and it is true that they have been developed in the Western world, or what is known as the Western world, over the centuries against great opposition. And in fact, until the Second World War, Europe was not an example of peace and prosperity. In my childhood, when I was in refugee camps in Germany, we lived years of hunger and lack after the end of the war, until we were scattered to immigration countries who were ready to receive refugees. And it was obvious that at that time there was no rule of law. One tyrant in Nazi Germany and his system had been defeated, but another, Stalin in the Soviet Union, remained in power. The idea of justice for all was a distant ideal. The structure, the very structure of the United Nations is a double bind in it. On the one hand, there's a basic principle, there's a flag for every nation who joins it, and that indicates that every nation has inherent sovereign rights that will be expected in the international sphere, and that none should be above others in terms of obeying the rules of international law. But the very structure of the Security Council, with 5 permanent members with veto rights, negates this very principle by giving more power to those who at the time were the victors of World War II, but who by now, of course, are not adequate to represent the distribution of populations or the distribution of economic strength and power across the world. Worst of all, in a modern world with the information technologies taking over so much of our lives, the concept of fairness and of justice gets perverted, and we have seen it recently in both the attack on Ukraine by the Russian Federation and the barbaric way in which that aggression continues, especially a war against civilians rather than war in the front, both going on at the same time. And the tendency in the United States to weaponize both trade routes and trade relations with a misunderstanding of what tariffs and taxes mean and what is the difference between them. But most alarmingly of all, an inability to accept the equality and the mutual respect that allies as well as partners owe to each other. As a former Canadian, I have been following with particular interest the way that Canada and America, two countries deeply entwined economically, were all of a sudden told that all ties were severed, that the US needed anything, we need nothing from Canada, when in point of fact the United States cannot even function without the raw materials, the energy, and other products that they get out of that country. And I think we saw in the case of Canada a very interesting phenomenon that gives us hope for the future for those who are also faced with such contempt and aggressivity even on the part of those whom one had thought to be one's friends, one's allies, and one's supporters. Canadian citizens have taken a simple, spontaneous decision no longer to go to the United States for their holidays, for their weekends, for passing through and so on. It's not a government decision. It is taken by citizens with their wallets, if you like, as agents, taking agency as individuals, and collectively they have created such losses to the American tourist industry, and with a domino effect on other important sectors of the American economy, that this spontaneous decision by single individual Canadians, shall I go on my holiday to anywhere else in the world except the United States, has had a significant effect. I think that this, the other example is Ukraine, which I think when Russia invaded it in 22, they were carrying dress uniforms. The soldiers were ready for a victory parade within a few days. The war sadly is going on and continues, and the heroic resistance has to go on, because unless it goes on, the Ukrainian people will be submitted to the brutalities and inhumanities that we saw in Bucha and Irpin and in various other places where the army of the Russian Federation had been going on its rampages of rape, pillage, marauding, and murder of civilians. Not a front and not a fight and not a war, but simply rampages and aggression towards civilians. The world is not a fair place, but I think that the examples that we see of solutions to aggressivity or contempt or lack of respect towards one's neighbors, the sense of entitlement, the sense of exceptionality, even the messianic idea that we, for instance, are going to impose the Russian world on all our neighbors and transform them into Russians because it's more convenient to us, and to deny their history, their achievements and their existence and their cultural differences. We are faced with contempt from the idea that big is great, and getting bigger and more aggressive and more sadistic is going to bring one greatness. The bigness by itself is confused with the idea of greatness. When we hear the slogan, "Make America Great Again," we should be thinking of greatness in the true sense of achievement, of merit, of the kind of qualities that one can truly admire for their achievements, not a denigration of others simply because they are the other or are possibly to be distinguished from ourselves by their looks and their appearance. The world is a dangerous place. The world is full of very dangerous and aggressive and, I would say, truly nasty and evil ideas. But at the same time, we do have something else to cling on. It's just like through history, there is true greatness. There is understanding of what fairness and justice and right and rules, what they mean, and how they can make the difference between barbarity and civilization. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we proceed with our debates at this wonderful forum, I hope that you will feel that you have contributed to this debate worldwide about where we stand, why things go wrong, and what we as individuals and as groups can do to help it to get better. Thank you.